Usually, when we think about how nations are formed, we picture the dramatic stuff.
They're a big cinematic moment.
Exactly. We imagine like generals pointing at massive maps or armies marching across endless plains, grand treaties being signed at the end of a bloody bayonet.
Yeah, there's this expectation of loud, forceful, sweeping conquest. It is the classic narrative of military history, really.
It is. We tend to focus entirely on who had the biggest guns.
Right, who was willing to draw lines in the sand by pure blunt force.
And it feels so binary. You win the war, you draw the map. But what if I told you that one of the most dynamic, economically powerful regions in the modern world wasn't united by a conquering army at all?
Which is pretty wild to think about.
It really is. It was united by a 19th century British administrator who essentially looked at a calendar and said, hey, everyone just wants to go fishing, right?
I mean, that is definitely one way to summarize it.
So today we are opening up a really fascinating stack of sources for you. We're centering this around a detailed Wikipedia article on the life and career of Colonel Samuel Hennell.
A name a lot of people probably haven't heard, honestly.
Right. But our mission for this deep dive is to figure out how this British Indian Army officer completely reshaped the geopolitical map of the Middle East.
And in doing so, laid the foundation for what you and I now know as the United Arab Emirates.
Exactly. And he didn't do it primarily through military force, which is the crazy part. He did it by cleverly leveraging a highly specific economic season.
Yeah, he practically invented a new model for conflict resolution in a region that had been plagued by really complex maritime warfare for generations.
Right.
And it requires us to completely rethink how empires usually operated in that era.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand what Hennell achieved, we have to understand the absolute powder keg he was walking into.
Oh, absolutely. A total powder keg.
We are going back to the Persian Gulf in the 1820s. And before we get to his brilliant truce, who exactly was Samuel Hennell? I mean, who was he working for?
Well, before he ever saw the Gulf, Hennell was an Englishman. He was tutored by a Mr. Williams of Edmonton.
Okay.
But he doesn't enter the region working directly for the British Crown. He enters service with the East India Company. And that is a crucial distinction for you to keep in mind here.
Right. I always hear about the East India Company in historical context, but what does that actually mean for the power dynamics in the Gulf at this time?
So the East India Company was essentially a massive multinational corporation.
Just a corporation with an army.
Yeah, a corporation that just happened to have its own private, heavily armed military. I mean, their primary goal wasn't planting flags for the king's glory.
It was money.
Exactly. Their primary goal was profit. They needed safe trade routes to move goods between India, the Middle East, and Europe.
Makes sense.
So when Hannibal arrives in the Gulf in 1826 as an assistant resident stationed in the port city of Budapest, the company is already deeply, deeply frustrated.
Frustrated because the trade routes weren't safe, right?
Right.
The atmosphere he steps into is incredibly tense. Just 6 years prior, in 1819, the British had launched this massive punitive expedition against the Al-Qasimi fleet at Ras Al-Khaimah.
Which was just a devastating show of naval force.
Right.
The British essentially bombarded the coastline.
Wow.
Yeah, they were trying to eradicate what they viewed as piracy, threatening their corporate shipping lanes. They burned ships, destroyed local infrastructure. They severely disrupted the local economy.
And that expedition was immediately followed by the General Maritime Treaty of 1820. Now, reading through the sources, this 1820 treaty feels to me like putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound.
That is a very good way to put it.
Right, because they blew things up and forced a treaty that basically said, stop attacking our ships or we'll come back and do it again. Am I misreading that, or was it really that short-sighted?
No, you're hitting on the exact flaw of the 1820 treaty. It was purely punitive. It temporarily stopped the violence out of sheer terror, basically, but it did absolutely nothing to solve the underlying regional tensions.
Because it didn't change anything fundamentally.
Exactly. It didn't address the economic desperation that caused local fleets to raid in the first place. I mean, you can't just burn someone's primary means of making a living and then demand they act peacefully forever.
Right, because punishing people into submission only goes so far. Eventually, the fear wears off, or the desperation outweighs the fear, and the fighting inevitably starts again.
It always does.
To actually achieve lasting peace, you need leverage. You have to offer them something better than what they get from fighting.
What's fascinating here is the critical shift the British and the East India Company were beginning to make in this specific region. And Hennell is the embodiment of that shift.
How so?
Well, he wasn't sent there just to be a soldier pointing a cannon. He was on the track to becoming a political resident.
And a political resident operates differently than a military commander, I assume.
Completely differently. The company realized that constantly launching these massive naval bombardments was incredibly expensive.
Right. Bad for the bottom line.
Yeah. And it ultimately ruined the trade environment they were trying to protect in the first place. So they needed to transition from merely punishing local fleets to actively trying to politically manage and mediate the region.
They needed an administrator who could understand the local dynamics, not just flatten them.
Precisely.
Which brings us to the pivot point of our story. We jump ahead to 1835. Hennel is now the acting political resident. He looks at this cycle of violence and retaliation, and he proposes a brand new maritime ceasefire.
Yes, and he bases it on the underlying ideas of that old 1820 treaty, but he adds a really unique twist.
Right, a highly specific time frame. He pitches a ceasefire that will only run from May to November. And this is where I have to push back a bit, because when you first read this, it sounds completely bizarre.
It does seem weird at first glance.
Wait, why just May to November? If you're an imperial officer trying to secure the seas, why on earth would you offer world peace, but just for the summer? It makes no sense to let everyone go back to shooting at each other in the winter.
It sounds totally absurd until you understand the local ecosystem. I want you, the listener, to think about what actually happens in the waters of the Persian Gulf between May and November.
I'm drawing a blank. What is the significance of those months?
It was the pearling season.
The curl dive.
Precisely. Hennel didn't just pick random dates out of a hat. He analyzed the local economy. The entire coastal population, all of these rival sheikdoms that were constantly warring with each other, they all relied on the annual pearl dive to survive and generate wealth.
Oh.
It was their absolute primary economic engine.
So paint a picture of this for us. What did the pearling season actually look like out on the water?
Picture yourself as a resident of the Gulf in 1835. Every summer, thousands of men would leave their coastal towns in vast fleets of wooden dhows.
That's a lot of boats.
Oh, massive fleets. And they would spend months out on the water, free diving to the ocean floor for oysters. It was grueling, highly dangerous work. You were dealing with the intense heat, the physical toll of holding your breath repeatedly, the risk of drowning.
Sounds terrifying, honestly.
It was, but it was the lifeblood of the region. The pearls they harvested paid for everything for the rest of the year.
And obviously, you can't exactly harvest pearls effectively if you are constantly looking over your shoulder to see if a rival fleet is coming to sink your boats and steal your catch.
Exactly. That was the genius of Hennel's proposal. He stripped away the grand, moralizing language about universal peace that usually accompanied European treaties of the era.
Because nobody was going to buy that anyway.
Right. He knew demanding permanent, idealistic harmony among bitter rivals would be rejected immediately. Instead, he offered a highly practical, culturally attuned business proposition. He basically said, let's stop fighting for these 6 months so everyone can make money safely.
He made peace more profitable than war. But how did he actually enforce this? Because, I mean, a piece of paper is just a piece of paper. If a skirmish breaks out on the water, how do you prevent it from escalating back into full-blown war?
He established very clear, mechanical rules for the truce. First, all participated rulers had to agree to avoid hostilities at sea entirely during those months.
Okay, standard ceasefire stuff.
But the real innovation was the redress system. If someone broke the rules and attacked your ship, you were strictly forbidden from retaliating. That was the cycle he had to break.
Wait, so if a rival attacks my pearling dhow, I just have to take the loss?
Not quite. You couldn't attack back, but you had to report the incident to the resident, to Hennel. The British essentially inserted themselves as the chief peace broker and the ultimate enforcer of reparations.
I see.
Hennel guaranteed that if you were wronged, you would receive full compensation from the offending party, backed by the threat of British enforcement. And furthermore, if any ruler planned to resume fighting when the truce ended in November, they had to formally declare their intent to do so.
It's an economic ceasefire with a built-in third-party arbitration system.
That is brilliant.
It really was. And the sources say he actually takes this pitch on the road. He holds an enthusiastic meeting at Basidu on the island of Kesham.
He does, and the diplomatic maneuvering here is top tier.
Yeah.
He didn't just blast a decree from his office in Bushehr. He sat down with the bitterest of rivals.
Face to face.
Face to face.
Yeah.
He initially pitched this to Sultan bin Saud al-Qasimi, who ruled Ras al Khaimah and Sharjah, and Shakbut bin Diab al Nahyan, the ruler of Abu Dhabi. Getting those specific powers to agree to lay down their arms, even temporarily, was a monumental achievement.
Because they actually saw the financial upside?
Yes, they liked the idea so much that Henel used that momentum to expand the circle. He brought in the rulers of Dubai and Ajman, and on August 21st, 1835, in Bushehr, the truce is formally signed.
What about Al-Qaim?
Good question. Al-Qaim was subject to Ras Al-Khaimah at the time, so they were bound by it as well without signing independently.
Okay, got it. The sources mention that Henel reported back to his superiors about a widespread joy and satisfaction diffused amongst the inhabitants of the whole line of the Arabian coast.
Which is a lovely quote.
It is. And looking at the mechanics you just described, I understand why. He effectively acted as the pressure valve. The ordinary people, the divers, the merchants, the families back on shore, they could finally have a season of guaranteed safety without the looming threat of maritime warfare wiping out their livelihood.
It served the immediate, tangible interests of every single signatory. They didn't have to suddenly love each other. They just had to love their purling profits more than they loved their vendettas for half the year.
It's a massive immediate success. But a 6-month pause in fighting is still just temporary. It's a stopgap.
Yeah.
So how does this seasonal summer truce evolve into a permanent geopolitical identity? How do we get from protecting oyster divers to building a modern nation-state framework?
That evolution reveals Henel's long-term vision. He didn't just pack up and consider his job done after that first summer. The seasonal truce of 1835 was so universally beloved by the local economies that it was renewed the next year. And the year after that,
Okay.
it became a reliable annual tradition.
You know, it's almost like a modern software subscription model. Henel started them on a free seasonal trial, like just try the piece out for a few months, see how it impacts your bottom line.
Exactly.
And the rulers realized that if peace is profitable during the pearling season, maybe it's actually just better for business in general.
That is a remarkably accurate way to look at it. He scaled up the diplomacy gradually, building trust step by step. In 1838, which happens to be the year Henel officially gets promoted to political residences, they make a massive leap. They agreed to make the agreement year-round. He upgraded them to an annual subscription.
And then, by 1843, they are ready for a much bigger commitment, so they sign a 10-year treaty. He locked them into a 10-year contract.
Yes. Because of these ongoing cascading truces, the sheikdoms of the lower Gulf became known globally by a brand new name, the Trucial States.
And that name stuck for over a century. It's incredible. But the sources also highlight that Henel was quite an innovator when it came to actual maritime law in the region. He didn't just rely on signed papers, he created physical boundaries.
Right.
Can you explain the restrictive line he introduced in 1846?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Henel was essentially drawing a new geopolitical map based entirely on conflict mediation. The restrictive line was a defined safe zone in the waters of the Gulf.
Okay.
If you look at a map, it stretched from the Persian coast down to the islands of Siri and Abu Musa, and it was later extended to the Sharjah-owned island of Sir Brunair.
But how do you enforce an invisible line in the ocean in 1846? That sounds impossible.
By tying it to absolute, uncompromising rules. The mandate for this zone was that acts of war were strictly prohibited within its boundaries at all times. Period. Whether there was a maritime truce in place or not, whether it was pearling season or not, if you crossed that specific line in the water, you had to put your weapons down. Any violation within that zone would bring the immediate wrath of the British Navy.
So he was creating a physical architecture for peace, a demilitarized zone designed specifically to protect commerce and safe passage.
And he also attempted to expand his peacemaking beyond the Trucial States themselves. In 1841, he concluded a 1-year naval truce with Abdullah II of Kuwait.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah, it prohibited Kuwait from undertaking maritime offenses and handed mediation over to the British. Now, that specific truce expired and wasn't renewed, but it demonstrates the sheer scale of Henel's ambition. He was actively trying to pacify the entire Gulf using this economic model.
And all of this careful, methodical, year-after-year work eventually culminates in the ultimate agreement. On May 4, 1853, the rulers signed the Perpetual Maritime Truce, the lifetime membership.
Exactly. This final treaty prohibited any act of aggression at sea permanently. It was signed by the leaders from al-Quwain, Ajman, Dubai, the Bani Yas, and the Qawasim.
Wow.
Now, to be historically precise, Henel himself had just retired and returned to England, so this final document was actually signed by his former deputy and successor, Arnold Burroughs Kemble.
But the sources make it explicitly clear. That perpetual truce was built entirely on the foundation Hennel had meticulously laid over the previous 20 years. Historians praise him as, without doubt, the greatest political resident Britain has ever had in the Persian Gulf, because he practically invented the concept of the trucial states, which is the direct legal predecessor to today's UAE.
He took a region defined by fractured retaliatory maritime warfare and slowly, using the lever of economics, forged it into a cohesive, peaceful economic bloc.
It is a monumental professional legacy, but I want to pivot the narrative here for a moment. We've talked extensively about the administrator, the architect of these treaties, but who was the man behind the paperwork? What did his actual life look like? And what was the ultimate personal cost of his lifelong service to the British Empire?
That's a heavy question.
It is, because reading through the latter half of his biography in the sources, the final act of his life is incredibly sobering.
It adds a deeply human and, frankly, tragic dimension to the history we've been discussing. You realize these figures aren't just names on treaties. They had families living alongside these historical events.
Could you walk us through those personal details? What happens to Hennel outside of the negotiation room?
During his time in the Gulf, Hennel builds a life. On November 28, 1837, while he's still a captain, right as he's transitioning these seasonal truces into year-round agreements, he marries Anne Inman Orton at Byculla in Bombay.
Yeah.
She was the eldest daughter of James Orton, who was the surgeon and head of the East India Company's medical board there.
So he marries deeply into the British colonial administrative family.
He does, and they have two sons, James Bruce, born in 1843, and William Frederick, born in 1850. Both boys are born right there in Bushehr, in the heart of the Gulf, while their father is mediating the restrictive lines and the 10-year truces.
Growing up right in the middle of it all.
Exactly. Finally, in 1852, the family leaves the Middle East. Hennel retires as a colonel in the Grenadier Regiment of the Bombay Native Infantry. They move back to England, taking up a quiet residence in Charlton Rings, Gloucestershire.
You would think that's the end of the story. A peaceful retirement after decades of service in the intense political pressure cooker of the Gulf?
You would think so.
But the story doesn't end peacefully, does it?
It doesn't. Both of his sons, James and William, follow in their father's footsteps. They travel back east to serve in the Indian Army, and in 1879, tragedy strikes the family. Both of his sons are killed during the Afghan War.
Both of them?
Both of them.
In the same year. And Samuel Hennel himself dies the very next year, in 1880, at the age of 80. I have to pause here because reading that specific sequence of events in the sources just stopped me in my tracks. The irony of this is devastating.
This raises an important question, doesn't it? It forces us to look at the dual, often profoundly contradictory nature of British imperial service in the 19th century.
Expand on that. What do you mean by the dual nature?
Consider the contrast. On one hand, you have administrators like Hennel who dedicate their entire adult lives to building incredibly durable infrastructures of peace and commerce. The trucial states were a masterpiece of conflict resolution. He proved that diplomacy, patience, and economic alignment could achieve what brutal naval bombardment simply couldn't.
Right.
He saved countless lives in the Gulf by ending the cycle of retaliation.
He was the ultimate peacemaker in that theater.
But on the other hand, the very same empire that empowered Hennel to make peace in the Gulf was simultaneously running a massive machinery of war elsewhere in India and Afghanistan across the globe. The empire required stability and peace in one region specifically to secure its trade and military logistics to fight conflicts in another. And ultimately, that vast machinery of war demanded fuel. It fed on generations of young men, including the sons of the very peacemakers who built the empire's stable foundations. Hennel secured the seas to protect life and commerce, but the empire's wars on the land claimed his own children.
That puts the whole era into a very stark, very human perspective. You build lasting peace in one corner of the map, only to lose your entire family line to a war drawn on another corner.
It illustrates how individuals, even those who achieve extraordinary things through diplomacy, are still caught within the larger, sweeping currents of the era they live in.
As we wrap up today's deep dive, I want to bring everything back to you listening right now. You might have started this wondering, why should I care about an obscure 19th century British administrator named Samuel Hennel? But the next time you see a photo of the skyline of Dubai or Abu Dhabi,
Or travel there.
yeah, the next time you read about the modern economic powerhouse that is the United Arab Emirates, I want you to remember how it started. You are looking at a society whose earliest unified framework was not born from violent sweeping conquest. It was born from a highly pragmatic economics-first agreement to protect the local pearling season. It was born because someone realized that people would rather fish in peace than fight in poverty.
And that history leaves us with a fascinating final thought to mull over. Consider Handel's restrictive line of 1846 that completely demilitarized safe zone in the middle of the ocean, created simply to ensure local business could thrive. If a 19th century administrator could successfully convince bitter, armed rival powers to respect an invisible line in the water just for the sake of commerce, what modern, seemingly intractable conflicts might benefit today from temporary, purely economic, polling season-style ceasefires?
That is a fantastic question to leave you with. Sometimes the path to peace doesn't start with changing hearts. Sometimes it just starts with aligning wallets. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.